At the time when Fabius began to write the history of Rome, his materials consisted of the Annals Pontificum, the Fasti, the Libri Pontificum and Augurales, the Laudations, and poetical lays. Of the meagerness of these materials, we have already satisfied ourselves. Yet one must ask, what was their authenticity? Perhaps they were not less authentic than our Merovingian and other ancient annals. Nay, as the Annals Pontificum began ab initio rerum Romanorum, or at least from the time of Numa, they might have been very authentic. In them, as we are informed by Dionysius, the pontiffs had recorded with the utmost accuracy every year of the kingly period. Even the triumphal lists mentioned the very days on which the kings had triumphed over their enemies. But the consideration that early history, as it has come down to us, is impossible, must lead us to inquire whether these earliest annals are deserving of credit. Our task now is to understand that the earliest history does contain impossibilities, that it is poetical, and that portions which are not of a poetical nature may be forgeries. Consequently, history must be traced back to ancient lays and to a chronology invented and adapted to these lays at a later period. The narrative concerning the primitive times given by Livy differs considerably from that of Dionysius. Livy wrote his first book without assigning the events to their particular years, and with an extraordinary want of criticism. Here, he evidently followed Ennius, as we may see by comparing the fragments of the poet's writings with the statements of Livy. Compare, for example, Livy 2.10 with the fragment of Ennius, and you will feel the soft echo of Rome's earliest voices across the centuries. Tec paper Tiberine tua cum numeral sancto. Dionysius, attempting to make out a true history, proceeds on the supposition that the detail of Roman history can be restored, and that the historical groundwork is only overgrown with legendary tales. He endeavors to reconstruct the former in an arbitrary manner, and inserts his pragmatical speeches in his account of the mythical ages, whereby he often makes himself truly ridiculous. Livy, on the other hand, wrote the history as he found it in the most ancient books, and as it appeared to him the most beautiful. He gives it in its ancient form, before it was artificially corrupted, and hence his narrative is the purest source for the history of those times. The story of the miraculous conception of Romulus is an historical impossibility, although in the school of Piso it was metaphorically transformed into history. The same must be said of the account of the rape of the Sabine women, whose number was 30 in the original tradition, and also of the ascension of Romulus during an eclipse of the sun. Such also is the character of the long reign of Numa, with its uninterrupted peace, and of his marriage with the goddess Egeria, which among the contemporaries of Scipio was as implicitly believed as the history of the Punic Wars. The story of the combat of the Horatii and the Curiatii, who were born on the same day of two sisters, carries a very ancient poetical character. We next come to Tarquinius Priscus, who was already married to Tanaquil when he migrated to Rome in the 8th year of the reign of Ancus, which lasted 23 years. Tarquinius himself reigned 38 years, and was at his death upwards of 80 years old. leaving behind him children under age who were educated during the 43 years of Servius's reign. Thus, Tarquinius Superbus must have been at least 50 years old when he slew his father-in-law. Tanaquil lived to see this crime, and required Servius to take an oath not to resign his crown. At that time, she must have been 115 years old. One of the first features in the story of Servius is that on one occasion in his infancy, his head was encircled with a flame, which Dionysius attempts to explain in a natural way. Calatinus is said to have been the son of a brother of Tarquinius. Priscus and his brother, it is said, was born before the migration of Tarquinius Priscus to Rome, that is, 135 years before the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus. Calatinus is described as being a young man, 30 years old, at a time upwards of 120 years after his father's birth. Brutus, the story tells us, held the office of Tiber Cellarum, the first place in the equestrian order, where he represented the king, assembled the Senate, and performed the most important sacrifices. Remarkably, the king gave this office to a man he thought an idiot, having deprived him of the management of his own property. Brutus, the tale continues, feigned idiocy to escape the envy and avarice of the king. He was the son of a daughter of Tarquinius Priscus, yet he feared to anger the king by taking possession of his own property, though, in truth, Tarquinius did not even belong to the same gens. At the beginning of the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, Brutus was but a child, yet immediately after the king's expulsion, he appears as the father of sons who had already attained manhood. All these chronological points, and many others, down to the time of Camillus, carry a sense of absurdity and historical impossibility, which invites the discerning listener to pause and reflect. Now, let us remember the twofold sources of the earliest history of Rome: the chronological, the Justi and Annals Pontificum; the non-chronological, the Lays, Laudations, the Libri Pontificum, and Augurales. Regarding the chronological sources, in the most ancient account, that of Fabius, we find 360 years reckoned from the founding of Rome to its destruction by the Gauls. Curiously, this is exactly the number of days in the Attic year, as even the Greeks, especially Aristotle, recorded. Grammarians like Pollux and Harpocration derive their information from this. Yet, 360, when examined carefully, is revealed to be the mean number between the days of the solar and lunar year, the nearest number that could be conveniently divided. Of this period of 360 years, the time assigned to the kings was, according to earlier calculations, 240 years, and that assigned to the Republic, 120 years. This number, like many in early Roman history, carries as much a mathematical character as a historical one, a reflection of the human desire to make sense of time and of the stories passed down through generations, whispering across the centuries. The early ages of the world, according to Indian, Babylonian, and other Oriental calculations, reflect a fascination with time, long before our records took shape. The 120 years assigned to the Republic is adopted even by writers who calculate the whole period at 365 years. Yet whether 120 years is correct depends on the view of when the capital was consecrated. That the Annals Pontificum were destroyed in the Gallic conflagration is strongly confirmed by Claudius, as noted by Plutarch, and indirectly by Livy, who could not state it directly, for he would thereby have rendered the first books of his own work valueless. It is further confirmed by the observation that the eclipse of the sun in the year AU 350, the first actually observed, was recorded in the Annals, whereas earlier eclipses were later calculated, and considering the limits of ancient science, were almost certainly calculated wrongly. For the first 240 years, there were 7 kings, each said to have reigned extraordinarily long, mostly around 40 years each. Even Newton remarked on the improbability of such longevity, assigning an average reign of 17 years to a king. Yet the closest parallel can be found in the doges of Venice, who, like the kings of Rome, were elective princes. Over 5 centuries, from AD 800 to AD 1300, Venice had 40 doges, roughly 8 per century. If we examine the number of Roman kings closely, we discover a similar numerical artifice, much like that among the Orientals. The Etruscans, as the foundation of their chronology, employed 2 kinds of secula, physical and astronomical. The astronomical seculum contained 110 years, considered the mean number of the physical, and by double intercalation, the calendar was restored with remarkable precision. These 110 years were nearly equal to 132 years of 10 months each, forming an astronomical period. The physical seculum, however, was defined by the Etruscans differently. The first seculum was determined by the lifetime of the longest-lived person at the foundation of the state, the second by the longest-lived person at the conclusion of the first seculum, and so on. Thus, ancient tradition, preserved in Plutarch and Dion Cassius, interweaves kings, years, and cosmic reckoning into a tapestry of time that is as fascinating as it is improbable. Dionysius has at least an allusion to it, that Numa was born on the day of the foundation of Rome. Thus, it is said that his death, in the year AU 77, determined the first seculum of Rome. If this was the case, we can understand why 30 years, the number of the Nundines in a year of 10 months, were assigned to Romulus and 39 to Numa. Regarding the last 5 kings, historical traditions existed, but they were not sufficient to cover the whole period. It was certain that Rome had far more than 5 kings, yet some were still missing. One is the founder of the rams, another is that of the titties. A number was thus chosen with sacred meaning, the number of planets, and other symbolic correspondences. The first half of 240 years coincides with the end of the 120th year, precisely the middle of the reign of the 4th king, manifestly an artificial invention. 23 years were assigned to him to begin with the year 110, for striking numbers were always desired at the start of a reign, and 110 was the sacred, secular number. The ancient year had 10 months, and 132 of such years are equal to 110 of the later solar years. It was therefore necessary to place the reign of Ancus between 110 and 132. The period between 77 and 110, 32 years, was naturally assigned to Tullus Hostilius. Tarquinius Priscus reigned until AU 170, with half a century added to half the years of the kingly period, making his reign 38 years. The 25 years of the last king may be historical, though it is possible that a quarter century was assigned to him. The period from AU 170 to AU 215 was left for Servius Tullius. Yet, if we suppose that the reigns of Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius did not last so long, all absurdities vanish, and the ancient unanimous account that Tarquinius Superbus was a son of Tarquinius Priscus is restored to its rightful place. Thus, we see how the greatest nonsense arises from chronological restorations. The forgery is manifest. Now, although the other sources of earliest history, the ancient lays, were not falsified, they are nevertheless entirely insufficient. We have a parallel in our own lay of the Nibelungen. Its authors intended no deception and did not pretend to give an annalistic history. Yet historical persons and events are woven into legend, preserving the memory of the past in a story both lyrical and enduring. In the early lays, historical figures such as Theodoric, Attila, and the Burgundians may occur, yet no single portion of the whole poem belongs purely to history. In the same way, history cannot claim Romulus and Numa. They dwell in the sphere of the gods. Romulus, son of Mars; Numa, the husband of Egeria. Romulus is but a personification of Rome itself. Other poems of similar nature contain more historical substance, such as the Spanish romances of the Cid. There, the fundamental features are indeed historical, but they form only a line, while the poem's surface is woven from narrative art. The same is true of many portions of early Roman history. Whoever entirely rejects it does not know what they are doing. Romulus and Numa form the first saeculum, for they do not belong strictly to history. They stand apart, a distinct and sacred period. Ancient traditions concerning subsequent kings were inserted into this chronological framework, preserving the memory of time as it was remembered, imagined, and structured. Consider, if you will, the Middle Age romances about Charlemagne and his paladins, drawn from Latin chronicles ascribed to Archbishop Turpinus. We now view these as romance, allowed to stand beside history. Yet scarcely 150 years after Charlemagne, in the reign of Otho the Great, when no idea of a crusade existed, the Chronicle of Benedictus of Sorac presents a detailed account of an expedition to Jerusalem, believed true by its contemporaries. Even before the Carolingian line ended, fabulous stories of Charlemagne's journeys across the Alps were recounted with the greatest assurance. Contemporary annals and Eginhard's biography now reveal the truth. The expedition to Jerusalem never occurred. The same patterns appear in Ireland, where annals enumerate kings, among them Neil the Great, contemporary, it seems, with Emperor Theodosius. He conquered Britain, Gaul, and Spain, crossed the Alps, and threatened the emperor in Rome, all of which modern scrutiny shows to be legend, embroidered with the grandeur of narrative imagination. Thus, in early histories, myth, legend, and sacred cycles blend seamlessly with the faint echoes of reality, creating a tapestry both lyrical and enduring, inviting us to listen with patience, wonder, and gentle contemplation. The history of early Rome, as we receive it, is often fabulous, for the authentic record of that period is largely lost to us. With equal facility, one might show that the earliest accounts of Rome are not entirely authentic, if we only had access to older historical books to correct the legends. But where are they to be found? The Greeks did not come into contact with Rome until much later. Though they possessed knowledge of the Romans earlier than commonly assumed, they gave them little attention, for direct contact was lacking. Perhaps the situation differed for the Greeks of southern Italy and Sicily, yet none of their writings survive. Neither Herodotus nor Thucydides mentions the Romans. An isolated fragment of Etruscan history does remain, giving a glimpse into how other nations recounted the story of Rome. The Emperor Claudius, unfortunate in youth and harshly treated by his mother, though possessed of amiable qualities, was misguided by his circumstances. Yet he stirred the sympathy of Livy, who instructed and encouraged him in historiography. Claudius wrote several works in Greek, Cap Alpharocated Eltomacronat Alpha in 8 books, and Tauromegai Oda Capromeginu in 20, now lost to us, their absence a great regret. Even Pliny does not mention the latter work. In the 16th century, 2 tables were discovered containing fragments of a speech by Emperor Claudius. In it, he proposed to the Senate that full franchise be granted to the Lugdunensian Gauls, admitting them into the Senate as long had been the custom in the Provincia Romana. The inhabitants of Gaul, though Roman citizens with Roman names, had not the right to sit in the Senate. Claudius sought to confer this privilege upon them, bridging the past and present, and showing how history, both lost and preserved, can be shaped by human hands and human laws. 2 tables of Tacitus still exist, though they do not preserve a continuous portion of the speech, unless a considerable piece is lost at the bottom of the first table. Before the French Revolution, these tables were kept in the Town Hall of Lyons. Their present whereabouts are uncertain, yet they provide a glimpse into Claudius's apparent foolishness, and we must admit the ancients were not unjust in this assessment. In his speech, Claudius details what Tacitus compresses into a few words. It ought not to be objected, the emperor says, that this is an innovation, since innovations have been made ever since the foundation of the state. Strangers have always been admitted, the Sabines of Tatius, even kings themselves, Numa, Tarquin the Etruscan from Greece, and Servius Tullius. According to our annals, he was a native of Corniculum, but in Etruria, an Etrurian named Mastarna, a follower of Cales Vibena. He migrated, settled on the Celian Hill, which was named after his leader, and called himself Servius Tullius. This is direct proof of the nature of Roman annals in those days. For nothing told of Mastarna can be directly applied to Servius Tullius, the son of a female slave. There is no doubt that the earliest history of Rome arose from lays. Perizonius mentions similar practices in other nations. Even in the historical books of the Old Testament, such lays are found. In relation to the Romans, he cites Cato's testimony, which Cicero mentions twice. Would that those lays were extant, says Cicero, which Cato records in Origins, sung many ages before his own time at repasts, in praise of illustrious men. A third mention comes from Varro and Conius Marcellus. Young boys, pueri honesti, sang at repast songs in praise of deceased great men, sometimes with, and sometimes without, the accompaniment of the flute. Every one of these testimonies must be considered valid. Across nations with early national literature, we encounter either long historical epics or short lays celebrating individual men. And thus, the Romans too preserved their early history in song and poem, fragments of which echo even through Tacitus and Claudius. Even in the earliest records of Roman history, fragments of their poetry have come down to us. Before the Romans adopted Greek poetry, they had their own verse, known as the Saturnian verse, which Horace once mentioned. Horridus al defluxit humoris Saturnius. Ancient grammarians, like Attilius Fortunationus, tried to explain it, though they only had a few lines to work with. One line, for example, reads, Mdam dabent metelli naivio popte. To the scholars of the time, it appeared to be a hypercatalectic scenarius. Even Terentius Morus, writing at the end of the 3rd century, compared its rhythm to the Anacreontic verse, yet the Saturnian verse was entirely different, independent of Greek meters. The Romans counted syllables to create rhythm. Unlike the Greeks, who based their poetry on music and time, the Romans focused on syllables, rarely measuring them in the Greek fashion. Long or short syllables were flexible. Sometimes a short syllable was treated as long, especially in the old hymns of the Latin Church. Plautus and Terence, in their iambic and trochaic verses, followed this principle, observing rhythm rather than strict timing. The Saturnian verse usually consists of 4 feet, each of 3 syllables. These feet could be Bacchics or Critics, often alternating with spondies. Sometimes the Critics predominated, sometimes the Bacchics. When the verses were pure, their movement was strikingly beautiful, but often the mixture made it hard to discern the pattern. These verses, used since the remotest times, resemble the Persian, Arabic, ancient German, Northern, and Anglo-Saxon poetry in which alliteration prevails. The Old German verse, for example, is divided into 2 halves, with alliteration appearing twice in the first half and again in the second. Through these ancient verses, we glimpse the minds of the early Romans, their music, their counting, their poetry, and the rhythm of a civilization long gone, but not forgotten. The ancient Saturnian verse, as used by the early Romans, had a rhythm that was strict yet flexible. Each line was divided into 4 feet, each foot containing 3 syllables. This fourfold rhythm can be found not only in Roman poetry, but also in the old Saxon harmonies of the Gospels, in Otfrid, and in others. Sometimes 5 or even 6 rhythms occurred. Across cultures, the same pattern appears. Persian verse often had 4 feet of 3 syllables. Arabic poetry sometimes followed this rule, though occasionally using 4-syllable feet. In Spain, the coplas de muerte mayor, common before the Alexandrine style, and later introduced to Flanders, followed the same meter. Even longer Provençal poems likely shared this rhythm. This ancient Roman meter continued to be used in Roman poetry up to the 7th century. Scholars have collected numerous examples, and some ancient grammarians left fragments, especially from Naevius, demonstrating the beauty of this verse. Plautus, too, developed it with elegance, showing its adaptability in drama and song. Romans also had smaller poems in this meter. At funerals, ninii were sung, accompanied by the flute. These were not sorrowful, melancholy dirges, as one might expect, but celebratory songs praising the deceased. They highlighted the virtues and glory of the departed, reminding the living to follow their example. In these songs, even death served the good of the republic. Horace once remarked, "Absent inni funere ninii, let there be no idle lamentation." Yet he referred to the later, mournful songs. In the earliest Roman times, ninii and laudations were plain and simple, meant to honor the dead and encourage the living. The words were not extravagant. Their purpose was to inspire, to teach, and to celebrate the enduring legacy of those who had gone before. Through these verses and songs, we see the character of early Rome, disciplined, respectful of tradition, and always mindful that even death could serve the state and guide the living. Some of the oldest Roman poems still survive on tombs of the Scipio family, discovered in 1780 along the Appian Way. The upper chamber, which once held the sarcophagi of the younger Africanus and a statue of the poet Ennius, had disappeared. But the lower chamber, carved directly into the rock, was found filled with debris. Among the remains were the sarcophagi of L. Scipio Barbatus, who had served as consul in 300 BCE, AU 454. Earlier visitors had removed one of the slabs, now embedded in the walls of the Barberini Palace. Yet, even in their incomplete state, the inscriptions on the sarcophagi offer a fascinating glimpse into Roman poetry. Though written like prose, the lines were in fact verses, marked by unequal line lengths. These verses are simple, yet rhythmic, likely reflecting the ninii, the songs sung at funerals to honor the dead and inspire the living. Cornelius Lucius Scipio Barbatus, noble by birth, brave and wise, consul, censor, aedile, who once stood among you. Such songs were not mournful dirges. Instead, they celebrated the lives of ancestors and served as moral examples for the living. Similarly, songs at formal feasts, called laudations, were plain, simple, and focused on praise. Beyond these short songs, the Romans also composed longer epic poems, much like other ancient cultures. For example, Among the Servians, songs combined epic and lyric elements, while modern Greek songs are mostly lyrical. Some of Livy's history may have been influenced indirectly by these epic fragments, preserved in the records of pontiffs and augurs. Stories like the fight between the Horatii and the Curiatii may have originated in such heroic poetry. Though Livy did not see all of these epics firsthand, the fragments filtered into his histories through Varro and other sources. These ancient songs and poems are key sources for early Roman history, blending legend, poetry, and memory into narratives that shaped Rome's earliest identity. Even as far back as the Gallic sack of Rome, the Romans were already shaping their history through poetry and records. Livy, for example, tells the story of Horatius' trial using ancient texts. In his account, he mentions a law called the lex horvendi carminis, and the formulae of the time, called Carmenia, followed ancient Roman meter. Cicero confirms that Livy drew on these old sources, noting that the formula for provocatio ad populum, the appeal to the people, was recorded in the Libri Augurales. The wording, still retaining traces of the old meter, read, Duumviri perdu Elianum judicent. This shows that even early Roman legal and religious formulas were closely tied to poetry and rhythm. Livy himself acknowledges, as Cicero observed, that history told through praise can easily become flawed. The pride of Roman families, meant to honor ancestors, sometimes degenerated into exaggeration or outright falsehood. After many early records were destroyed in the Gallic invasion, the surviving history was reconstructed from songs of the Vates, poet-prophets, and family laudations. These oral traditions were passed down, gradually altered, and became the foundation of early Roman history, the material Fabius discovered when he began writing. Take, for example, the campaigns of Fabius Maximus Relianus. In Livy's 10th book, he gives extraordinary detail, far beyond what one might expect. These specifics often came from family records, which could include exaggerations or even fabricated triumphs and consulships, all in the name of family pride. Similarly, national pride led to historical embellishments, particularly regarding major calamities. Events like Porsena's War, the Gallic sack of Rome, and the defeat at Caudium were often distorted or exaggerated. Party politics also played a role. Accusations between factions were sometimes inserted into history, while certain moral or political crimes were glossed over to protect reputations. The people, in these narratives, were sometimes blamed for disasters they could not have caused, reflecting the biases and ambitions of those recording history. Even when the Romans were innocent, biased decision-making by the Curii often distorted events. It wasn't the people who condemned Manlius to death, it was the Curii. They were also responsible for the inglorious judgment between the Arcletans and the Aracinians, and we may even be convinced that Camillus was forced into exile by their influence. Such distortions accumulated over time, intertwining with one another, creating a confusing historical record. While the sources are scattered, Careful analysis allows us to reconstruct the general constitution and character of the Roman nation, giving us a fairly accurate outline of Roman history, at least up to the war with Pyrrhus and the First Punic War. Many details remain obscure, but historians can distinguish between likely facts and probable embellishments. Roman history traces back through Latium to Troy. For centuries, scholars debated whether Troy even existed and whether Aeneas truly came to Italy. Theodore Riccius, a well-known scholar, treated Aeneas' arrival as historical, while Bochet, another brilliant philologist from France, argued differently. Bochet's ideas about Phoenician influence are likely overextended, but both scholars remind us that the story of Aeneas blends legend with potential historical truth. Today, we would ask a slightly different question. Do these Trojan legends have any historical basis? Did the story come from Greek sources, or is it of native Italian origin? If the latter, then there might be a kernel of truth beneath the legend. The less literally we take these ancient tales, the more plausible they become as reflections of real events. Unquestionably, in the earliest times of Greece, there existed similar traditions and epic stories, blending myth, memory, and history, a pattern we also see in early Roman traditions. Even though two nations may be closely related, they can still be so different that they do not understand each other's language. Herodotus points this out about the Greeks and the Pelasgians. Though their languages seemed barbarous to each other, the two peoples were still closely connected. We see similar cases even today. Consider Polish and Lithuanian. Their grammar, numbers, and many words are similar, but a Pole would still struggle to understand a Lithuanian. Or take Italian and Spanish. Again, closely related but not immediately comprehensible to speakers of the other language. This is exactly how we can interpret the relationship between the Greeks and the Pelasgians. Herodotus emphasizes their differences, yet he also groups them together, showing that there was no radical cultural divide. In the earliest times, when Greek history remained shrouded in mystery, the Pelasgians inhabited much of Italy, the eastern Adriatic coast, Epirus, Macedonia, southern Thrace, the Aegean Islands, and even the coasts of Asia Minor up to the Bosporus. The Trojans, too, were Pelasgians. They were far from barbarous, as confirmed by all Greek sources, including Homer. They lived in a Pelasgian land but had Greek names. Sometimes the Trojans are linked to the Arcadians, another Pelasgian people, other times to the Epirots or the Thessalians. In one tradition, Aeneas migrates to Arcadia and dies there. In another, he goes to Epirus where Helenus is settled. Pindar's poem on Cyrene also reflects this complex network of related peoples and places, showing how intertwined myth, legend, and history were in the ancient Mediterranean world. Aristeus, a Pelasgian hero from Arcadia, played a key role among the Antinoridae, a noble line connected with the Trojans. The ties between the Pelasgians and the Trojans stretch far back in time. Samothrace, in particular, was considered a metropolis of Ilium, a spiritual and cultural hub. According to legend, Dardanus, a figure originating from Arcadia, journeyed through Samothrace, married Cleis, and then continued to Troas. Interestingly, some ancient sources even describe the Samothracians as a Roman people, considered brothers of the Romans, the Troecuterinian Pelasgians. While these claims may seem mythological, they reflect the shared kinship and cultural connections among the Tyrrhenians, Trojans, and Samothracians. Some accounts suggest Dardanus moved from Tyrrhenia to Troas, while others reverse the route, showing the flexibility and fluidity of early myths. The temple and mysteries of Samothrace served as a sacred meeting place for people from all over the known world. Much like the Kaaba in Mecca, the tomb of the Prophet in Medina, or the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem centuries later. For the Pelasgian nations, sites like Samothrace and Dodona were central religious and cultural locations, just as Delphi and Delos held immense significance in the Hellenic world. Distance did not matter. Just as pilgrims traveled across continents to Mecca, Pelasgians from far-flung tribes journeyed to these sacred centers. This widespread Pelasgian race stretched as far as Liguria and also inhabited parts of Corsica and Sardinia. Over time, as historical records emerge, this body of nations gradually disappears from the scene. Originally, it consisted of many tribes with distinct names, but eventually only remnants and isolated groups remain. A particularly extensive name for the part of this race that inhabited Epirus and southern Italy, at least as far as Latium and the Adriatic coast, was Sicily, sometimes called Vituli, Vitelli, or Vitali Itali. From these peoples, the very name of Italy is believed to have been derived. Despite the broad use of this Sicilian or Italian designation, it seems that in the earliest periods, Italy did not refer to the entire peninsula up to the Alps, as it does today. The boundaries and understanding of the land evolved over time, shaped by migration, conquest, and the blending of many ancient tribes. The migration of northern tribes had a profound impact on the geography and naming of early Italy. Over time, these movements separated the coastal regions of Etruria from the rest of Italy and gradually confined the name Italy to the land south of the Tiber, or perhaps even only to the areas south of Latium. This, however, remains a hypothesis. What is certain is that at one point, Italy extended northwards from the Garganus in the east to Terracina in the west. Later, the name became more limited, only to expand again after the time of Alexander the Great, before the rise of Roman dominion. This broader conception of Italy is likely what Pliny the Elder had in mind when he wrote that Italy resembles a leaf in shape. He undoubtedly borrowed this from Timaeus, who also originated the famous comparison of Sardinia to a sandal or footprint. Pliny, however, seems to have overlooked the fact that Italy of his own time no longer matched that description, a telling example of the hasty and careless manner in which he sometimes wrote. In southern Italy, the earliest inhabitants included the Oenotrians and Pusetians, while in the north, Liburnians and Tyrrhenians inhabited the coasts of Latium. Whether the northern coastal settlements were remnants of an older people or simply colonies is no longer clear. Central Italy, however, also hosted tribes different from the Greeks, who eventually overwhelmed the earlier populations. These migrations mirror patterns familiar from later history, where one nation often displaced another. The people who simultaneously advanced upon the Sicily and Latium and the Itali in southern Italy, partly expelling and partly assimilating them, were known as the Oppici, a transitional people. Though the Oppici existed as a distinct group only in a few places, their merging with other subdued peoples eventually produced new communities. These groups appeared under various names, though all shared the same root syllable, such as the Apuli. In these cases, the suffixes "ikis" and "ulus" were considered equivalent, showing how these ancient populations were connected and evolved into the Italian peoples known from later history. The Oppici's presence in Apulia stretched as far as Balasapia, where some groups of the Itali managed to survive in relative isolation. They also inhabited regions later known as Samnium and Campania, and along the borders of Latium under the names of Volscians and Equi. However, the Opicans were gradually pushed forward by the Sabines, or Sabellians, who considered themselves autochthonous, claiming origin from the highest mountains of the Abruzzo, near Magella and Gran Sasso d'Italia. Interestingly, Cato suggested they came from the small district of Amiternum, although this seems unlikely. Whether the Sabellians and Opicans were entirely distinct peoples, like the Gauls and Ligurians, or only politically separated branches of the same stock, remains uncertain. The ancients themselves had no clear understanding of these distinctions and paid little attention to them. Trying to insist on firm answers where no historical evidence exists can strain the mind, much like straining the eyes in the dark. Varro, for instance, distinguished between the Sabine and Oscan languages, but his knowledge of ancient languages was limited. Compared with modern linguistic understanding, such as that of W. von Humboldt, Varro's observations offer only a tentative guide. Based on general analogy, it is plausible that these peoples migrated in various directions, perhaps driven by early pressures that pushed the Sabines from their northern homelands, though this remains speculative. The Umbrians might have belonged to the same broader stock as the Opicans. Yet, one must not overemphasize the similarity of names. Closely related peoples can have very different names, while unrelated groups may share similar ones. For instance, the Geti and the Goths were long thought to be the same people, and 50 years ago, scholars in Ireland and Scotland mistakenly identified the furbolgs mentioned in the poems of Ossian as the ancient Belgians. In reality, as a well-informed English scholar pointed out, they were a Danish colony. We must be extremely cautious about the temptation to interpret the history of nations based solely on their names. This desire has given rise to countless hypotheses and fanciful theories, often more misleading than enlightening. Certainly, studying names can provide insight, but what might hold true in one case can easily become false in another, leading scholars astray with assumptions that must be treated like vermin or serpents to be avoided at all costs. For instance, had we only the names, we might hesitate to claim that the Opicans and Umbrians were connected. Yet, ancient historian Philistus refers to the people who conquered the Siculians in Latium as the Ambricans, and the linguistic affinities of their remnants support this connection. These shifts of nations, where the earliest inhabitants were successively displaced, one tribe replacing another, make the history of early Italian peoples exceedingly obscure. Even when we have a reasonably clear picture, errors and misconceptions in the sources persist, sparking endless debate. Ultimately, a perfectly objection-free solution is impossible. Those who study these histories must often be content with evidence that only appears true, while carefully tracing the origins of misconceptions. Lecture 11. At a period we cannot precisely define, there existed a people known as the Siculians in what later came to be called Latium. Some evidence even suggests that this region may have borne the name from the earliest times. The memory of these people was preserved in the town of Tiber, part of which, according to Cato, was called Siculo. Ancient authors provide countless statements confirming the Siculians' existence, both in Italy and in the island we still know today as Sicily. According to one tradition, a leader named Sicelus led them from Latium to Oenotria. Another tradition suggests that the Siculians, under different names, were driven from their original homes by the Opicans or Umbrians, eventually migrating to the island of Sicily. These differing accounts reveal the efforts of historians to establish that the same people existed simultaneously in both Latium and Sicily. The migration may have occurred, but it is equally possible that the movement happened in the opposite direction. What is certain is that the Siculians lived in southern Italy even in Homer's time. Evidence comes from a passage by Alcmaeon, a pupil of the historian Aristarchus, cited by the scholiast on the Odyssey. Alcmaeon mentions a prince named Echitus, ruler of the Sicilians in Epirus, confirming that the name Siculians was recognized beyond Sicily itself. When the poet of the Odyssey refers to the Sicilians, he likely means the inhabitants of southern Italy or the Pelasgians of Epirus, not the island of Sicily, which was scarcely known to him. The Siculians are the same people that Cato calls the Aborigines. The term can mean ancestors, Yepsipsa, or wandering people, Aborigines, but more likely it signifies those who have existed from the very beginning, aborigine. The nominative singular in Latin would have been aborigines. Although some traditions claim that Latium was originally inhabited by autochthons, Cato and C. Sempronius suggested that the Aborigines had come from Achaia, that is, from the Peloponnesus, which the Romans collectively called Achaia at the time. Some authors applied the epithet Argive to places otherwise called Siculian. Cato did so even with Tiber. Names such as Argos and Larissa appear wherever Pelasgians settled, Argos likely meaning town, and Larissa a citadel, or arx. When the Peloponnesus was Pelasgian, it was called Argos, just as Thessaly was. In this sense, the Argives are Pelasgians. In ancient tragedy, the term Apian Hegial is always mentioned together, one probably representing the wider region, the other a more localized area. All we know about the Latins is that they possessed a series of towns stretching from Tiber to the Tiber River. How far they extended in the earliest times toward the Liris remains uncertain. According to Cato, as quoted by Priscian, the land of the Volscians once belonged to the Aborigines, and it is clear that all the towns along the coast, such as Antium and Circei, were early Tyrrhenian settlements. At that time, the name Latium covered a very wide area. Even immediately after the period of the Roman kings, Latium extended as far as Campania, though later restricted by massive migrations that followed the expulsion of the kings. Hesiod, of course, refers to an earlier period. In the treaty between Rome and Carthage, the names Latium and Latins extend along the coast beyond Terracina, likely as far as Cumae. The Pelasgian inhabitants of the entire western coast of Italy were called Tyrrhenians by the Greeks and Tyrrheni or Tussi by the Latins, derived from Tussis or Turris, with an early linguistic substitution of S for R, as in Fusius for furious. It is important to remember that the Pelasgians and Aborigines were essentially the same people. When we examine traditions of nations, we often find the same events told in opposite ways. For example, a story of a Jew taking revenge on a Christian in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice is reversed in a Roman tale written just before Shakespeare's time, where the Christian is depicted as threatening the Jew. Similarly, migrations of the Goths are described in opposite directions depending on the source. Dionysius and Varro provide conflicting accounts regarding the Aborigines and Siculians. Both knew that the Latins were a combination of two nations, but they confused the conquering with the conquered. Following Hellenicus, they traced the Aborigines to Thessaly, then migrated them from the Upper Anio to Upper Abruzzo, pushed by the Sabines. This migration has a local and probable character, as small townships existed in that area. Large towns, like those in Etruria, usually indicate immigration by a larger group. Among the conquering tribes, one may have been called the Cassi. Whether they belonged to the Tyrrhenians, Latins, or Siculians, or were foreign immigrants, is uncertain, though the latter seems more probable. The name Cassi is preserved by Servius from Sopsius, a grammarian from the 1st century CE. They also appear as the Socrani, from which Varro and Dionysius inferred they were an ancient people. Another tribe, known under the names Opicans, Oscans, and Umbrians, inhabited the interior of Italy, probably pushed forward from the north and squeezed between ancient Pelasgian settlements. They settled in the Apennines around Lake Fucinus, modern Celano, toward Riete, with their capital called Lista. The Siculians, who dwelt above Tiber, had their boundaries stretching inland. There was a tradition that during their war with the Sabines, who had already taken Riete, they made a sacred vow, a sacrum. This practice was common among Italian nations in times of misfortune and was also observed by the Romans. They vowed to dedicate all the cattle and produce of the next spring to the gods, and to send out as colonists the male children born in that season. The vegetable produce was either offered as sacrifice or its value given in money. Having made this vow, the Socrani marched towards Latium and subdued the Siculians. There they settled among the ancient inhabitants, merging into one people called the Prisci Latini. The Cassi were probably included in this term as well. In Latin, Prisci Latini simply means very ancient Latins, reflecting the juxtaposition of two inseparably connected ideas, rather than any architectural or grammatical construction. This has been clearly shown by Bressonius, who also explained the famous formula Populus Romanus Quaerites. Similarly, patres conscripti meant those fathers who were enrolled, and legal phrases like locati conducti or empty venditi followed the same principle. Priscus and cascus eventually came to mean very ancient or old-fashioned, giving rise to phrases like cas loci or vocabula cusca. The conquerors spoke Oscan, and when their language mixed with that of the Pelasgo-Siculians, it created the curious blend we now call Latin. Its grammar, and especially its etymology, contains a significant Greek element, brilliantly studied by C. O. Muller in his first volume on the Etruscans. Some traces of the primitive Oscan language still survive in inscriptions found at Pompeii and Herculaneum. It would be a mistake to interpret Prisci Latini and Livy as ancient Latins. Livy took the formula from the ritual books of the Officiales, referring to the time of Ancus Marcius. Before the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, there were no distinct Latin colonies. Of the two elements in Latin, the Greek and non-Greek, the latter corresponds to Oscan. Words relating to agriculture, domestic animals, and produce of the field are primarily Greek or related. What emerges is a clear picture: a conquered agricultural people and a mountain tribe that did not farm. From then on, the original traditions fade, replaced by the story of Trojan immigration. The story of Aeneas and the Trojan settlement in Latium is later embellishment. Naevius, in his poem on the Punic War, provides one of the earliest accounts, written nearly 950 years after Troy's destruction. Virgil later reshaped this tradition as a poet, smoothing rough historical details. The earliest records depict Aeneas arriving with a single ship, and the land granted to him was modest, about 700 jugera. Preserving the memory of such a small settlement over 9 centuries is remarkable, if not improbable. The original tradition tells us that Aeneas first dwelt for 3 years in a small town named Troy. He then moved further inland and founded Lavinium. About 30 years later, Alba was founded, and 300 years after Alba, Rome was established. These neat progressions of numbers show that the account is more symbolic than historical. In fact, it appears that the duration of Rome's history was deliberately fixed at 3,000 years. There were 2 distinct numerical systems in these traditions: the Etruscan, with a saeculum of 110 years, and the Greek or Tyrrhenian, where a saeculum was 30 years. This number 30 was always important because it was believed, according to Servius, that the revolution of Saturn was completed in 30 years. 30 ordinary years made 1 Saturnian year, and 100 Saturnian years formed a great year. This is how the numbers progress from the foundation of Lavinium to the building of Rome. The earliest history of Alba is essentially worthless, as pointed out by the careful scholar Dodwell. The chronology of the Alban kings and Dionysius is full of inconsistencies and falsehoods. Their names are thrown together haphazardly. This forgery, according to Servius, was created late in history by a freedman of Sulla, L. Cornelius Alexander of Miletus, who became popular because people loved stories about periods that were otherwise shrouded in mystery. In my view, Alba on the Alban Lake was the capital of the ruling conquerors. Its name is no accident. It matches the town on Lake Fucinus, where the Socrani had originated. When they had to give up their homeland to the Sabines, they founded a new Alba on a lake. Much like the Carthaginians built a new Carthage, the Milesians a new Miletus on the Black Sea, and as the English often did in the New World, Alba Longa became the seat of the Cassi or Socrani. The earlier Latin towns in the region likely faced two fates. Some received settlers from the newcomers, while others were subjugated without new colonists. Tradition says there were 30 Latin towns, all said to be colonies of Alba, though another account claims they were originally Argive towns. Perhaps both can be true if a ruling elite settled in each town. Here's what we now understand. Alba had 30 surrounding territories, or populi albanses, which I discovered mentioned in Pliny. These towns were related to Alba in the same way the plebs related to Rome, and later, Rome related to Latium. Before its destruction, Alba likely held sovereignty over Latium, just as Rome did later. Alongside the 30 Alban towns, there were also dependent towns of the Praesii Latini, whose exact early status remains uncertain. When Alba is mentioned, many people, myself included, might think its history is almost completely lost, and that we can only speak of it in relation to the Trojan era, as if all Roman accounts were fiction and error. However, this is not the case. It is true that stories about Ascanius founding Alba, the omens and miracles, the line of Alban kings, and the tales of Numitor and Amulius, as well as the city's eventual destruction, are not historical. Yet, the existence of Alba itself is historically certain. The Sacra Albana and the Albani tumuli and sacred groves, which lasted until Cicero's time, are strong evidence of its early presence. Though the ruins no longer exist, the site in the valley of Grotta Ferrata can still be recognized. Between the lake and the hills near the monastery of Palaznolo, the rock was cut steeply, clearly a man-made defense, while the summit formed the arx or citadel. The Albans, according to tradition, held sovereignty over Latium, and the Latins later became the masters of the district and the temple of Jupiter. The tradition that Alba shared the victim of sacrifices with 30 towns, and that after Alba fell the Latins chose their own magistrates points to real historical practices. Even today, the ancient canal for draining the Alban lake, called the Fossa Cluilia, can be seen. Its vault is older than any Roman construction. So, in essence, Alba was the capital, exercising sovereignty over Latium. Its temple of Jupiter served as the rallying point, and the gens Silvia was the ruling clan. The number of Latin towns was 30, the same as the Albintian demes. This number recurs later in 30 Roman tribes, and in the story of Lavinium, founded by 30 families, showing a continuity of tribal organization. The claim that Lavinium was a Trojan colony restored by Alba is a narrative adaptation to combine Trojan and native traditions. Lavinium was effectively the central point of the Praesae Latini, and before Alba's dominance, worship was offered both at Alba and Lavinium, just as later in Rome. The Temple of Diana on the Aventine served dual purposes. After the Battle of Lake Regillus, the Latins appear in the treaty with Rome as 30 towns. The Albans, in their earliest times, also presided over 30 towns. These towns, however, were not always the same. Some disappeared, others were added, reflecting an instinctive tendency to maintain fixed numbers, similar to practices seen in the 12 Achaean towns or the 7 Frisian maritime communities. Thus, we can understand Alba with its 30 demes and 30 Latin towns, initially allied with Alba, later under its supremacy. According to Cato via Dionysius, the ancient Aborigine towns were small settlements scattered across the mountains. One such town on the Palatine Hill bore the name Roma, which is certainly of Greek origin. Nearby, other towns had Greek names, such as Perge and Alsium, showing the inhabitants were closely related to the Greeks. Even places like Terracina, formerly Tpsavy, or Formii, from GPPOF, Roadstead, or Anchorage, hint at Greek influence. Certain place names in ancient Latium, like Perge, mean towers. Ronza means strength. Even the name Roma reflects Pelasgian roots. Evander, a legendary figure, lived in this Pelasgian Roma. He brought civilization. He taught the alphabet and encouraged learning. The first foundation of civilization in Italy is said to be by Saturn in the Golden Age. Virgil wrote that the first humans were created from trees. This should be taken literally. Just as Greek myths describe humans from stones or ants, divine power turned trees into humans in Italy. These beings were initially half-human. They gradually learned culture under Saturn. Evander provided formal knowledge. The Romans believed that Romulus, founder of Rome, was born of a virgin by a god. He was saved from the Tiber floods and raised by a she-wolf. This story is very old. Romulus's mother was Ray Silvia, daughter of Numitor. Some later writers called her Ilia, daughter of Aeneas. But this could not have been believed by early Romans. Aeneas had lived centuries earlier. The statue of the she-wolf was erected in AU 457, long before later authors wrote about it. Alba was connected to Rome. An altar at Bovilli shows this link. The Gentiles Julii erected it according to Alban law. Numitor and Amulius fought for Alba's throne. Amulius won. He made Ray Silvia a Vestal virgin to end Numitor's line. The name Ray Silvia is ancient. Ray is a surname. In Tuscany, Rea Femina still means a woman with a ruined reputation. One day, while fetching water during a solar eclipse, Ray Silvia took refuge in a cave. There, Mars overpowered her. Later, she was delivered. The sun reappeared, and the statue of Vesta covered its eyes. Livy told this story but omitted miraculous parts. Alba ruled Latium. Its temple of Jupiter was the central rallying point. The ruling gens Silvia controlled Alba. Many legends about early Rome are poetic, but they reflect the real political and religious connection between Alba and Rome. Res Silvia, the daughter of Numitor, was thrown into the river Anio as an infant. She drowned in the waves, but the river god saved her soul. He transformed her into an immortal goddess and married her. Later versions of the story softened it, turning it into a tale of her imprisonment. This is likely a later invention and less poetic than the original story. The river Anio carried the cradle like a boat into the Tiber. The Tiber then carried it to the foot of the Palatine Hill. Floodwaters overturned the cradle near a fig tree. A she-wolf found the babies and suckled them. A woodpecker brought them food, and a protective bird, Para, kept insects away. These details come from various sources. Ancient historians tried to avoid the miraculous parts. Faustulus, a shepherd, found the boys and raised them with his 12 sons. They became strong and skilled. As leaders of the Palatine shepherds, they quarreled with the Aventine shepherds of Numitor. Remus was captured and taken to Alba. Romulus rescued him. Their descent from Numitor was revealed. Numitor regained the throne. The two young men were allowed to establish a settlement at the foot of the Palatine Hill. Later writers tried to make this story more credible. Livy avoided the most miraculous parts. Plutarch suggested that a demon might have fathered Romulus. Others claimed Amulius, in disguise, overpowered Res Silvia using artificial thunder and lightning. This was supposedly to justify imprisoning her. Numitor requested the children be exposed. 2 other boys were substituted. Numitor's grandsons were sent to a friend in Gabii. They were educated according to their rank and taught Greek literature. Some historians falsely claimed that the Alban nobility migrated with the brothers to Rome. But if that were true, there would have been no need for an asylum or arranged marriages with other nations. More historically important is the disagreement between Romulus and Remus about the city's location. Both were kings and equal leaders. Romulus wanted the city on the Palatine Hill. Remus preferred the Aventine, or according to some, the hill Remuria. Plutarch identifies Remuria as a hill south of Rome, near St. Paul's. It had fine air, important for early settlements. Healthy air in ancient times likely matched modern conditions. A dispute arose over the city's name and site. Remuria existed on the southern hill, but later the name moved to the Aventine. Augurs were called to decide. Romulus stood on the Palatine, Remus on the Aventine. Remus saw 6 vultures flying north to south at sunrise. He informed Romulus. Romulus, annoyed at not seeing a sign, sent a messenger claiming he had seen 12 vultures at the same time. The story says that 12 vultures appeared, which Romulus claimed as his sign. This part of the story is impossible. The Palatine and Aventine hills are so close that anything seen from one would be visible from the other. The story can only make sense if Remuria is substituted for the Aventine. The Palatine was home to the noblest patrician tribe. The Aventine belonged to the plebeians. A long-standing rivalry existed between the two. Over time, the story of Remuria was shifted to the Aventine. Ennius said that Romulus observed from the Aventine. In that case, Remus must have been on Remuria. When Romulus got the augury, he threw his spear toward the Palatine. This is the older, more reliable legend, later neglected by writers. Romulus took possession of the Palatine. The spear took root and became a tree, existing until Nero's time. This symbolized the city's eternity and divine protection. The story that Romulus tried to deceive Remus is a later addition. Ennius's poem, quoted by Cicero, does not mention it. Originally, there were two towns, Roma and Remuria. Remuria was far from the Palatine. Romulus set the city's boundaries. Remus scornfully leapt across the ditch and was killed by Celer. This was a warning that no one should cross Rome's fortifications. Romulus became melancholic over Remus's death. He established festivals in his honor and placed an empty throne beside his own. This marked a double kingdom, ending with Remuria's defeat. Roma and Remuria were Pelasgian towns. Ancient tradition says the Siculi migrated south from Rome, and the Tyrrhenian Pelasgians moved forward into Lucania and Sicily. Greeks considered Rome a Pelasgian or Tyrrhenian city. Some fragments call Rome a sister city to Antium and Ardea. Evander, an Arcadian and Pelasgian, lived on the Palatine. He brought culture, the alphabet, and arts to the Pelasgians, much like Damasratus did in Etruria. Rome was therefore a Latin town with a purely Tyrrheno-Pelasgian population. Romulus found his group too small. The 3,000 foot soldiers and 300 horsemen mentioned by Livy are only later military arrangements applied to early times. Ancient tradition says Romulus's band was too small. He opened an asylum on the Capitoline Hill. It was small, showing historical misunderstanding. Thieves, murderers, and vagabonds came there. This was the origin of the Roman clients. The patricians were descendants of Romulus's free companions. Those who took refuge in the asylum became clients under the protection of free citizens. Romulus needed women. He tried to form marriages with neighboring towns, like Antemne, only 4 miles away, and the Sabines. When refused, he used a clever stratagem. He proclaimed he had found the altar of Consus, god of councils, symbolizing his cunning. During this celebration, 30 Sabine maidens were carried off. These women later became the wives for the Curii. This is the genuine ancient legend. It shows how small ancient Rome was thought to be. Later, people considered the number too small. They supposed that 30 women had been chosen by lot to give names to the Curii. Valerius Antius later claimed that 527 women were carried off. The abduction is said to have happened in the 4th month of the city. This is because the Consualia festival was in August, and the festival of Rome's foundation was in April. Later writers, like C.N. Gellius, extended this period to 4 years. Dionysius found this version more credible. The abduction led to wars. First, Rome fought neighboring towns, defeating them one by one. Finally, there was a war with the Sabines. The ancient legend does not say this war lasted long. Later historians assumed it lasted longer, using different standards of time. Lucumo and Caclius helped Romulus. This refers to Salus Vibina's expedition, a much later event. The Sabine king, Tatius, was tricked into settling on the hill now called the Tarpeian Rock. A battle took place between the Palatine and the Tarpeian Rock. Neither side won decisively. The Sabine women intervened. They stopped the fight. An agreement was made. Sovereignty would be shared between Romans and Sabines. According to the annals, this happened in Rome's 4th year. This arrangement lasted only a short time. Tatius was killed during a sacrifice at Lavinium. His throne remained vacant. During their joint reign, each king had a senate of 100 members. The two senates consulted separately, then met together, called comitia. After Tatius's death, Romulus ruled alone. Ancient legend does not describe him as a tyrant. Ennius says Romulus was mild and benevolent, while Tatius was a tyrant. The ancient legend only mentions the beginning and end of Romulus's reign. Stories of wars with the Veientines, Phaidnates, and others are later inventions. The poem itself is beautiful, but these added narratives are absurd. For example, Romulus allegedly killed 10,000 Veientines by himself. The ancient poem moves to the end of Romulus's life. Jupiter took him to Mars, making Romulus the only man admitted among the gods. The legend says he reviewed his army near the marsh of Caprae. At that moment, there was a solar eclipse and a hurricane. Mars descended in a fiery chariot and took Romulus to heaven. Later stories distorted this. Some claimed Romulus was killed by senators and cut into pieces under their togas. This absurd tale suggested he had become a tyrant, and the senators took revenge. After Romulus's death, Romans and the people of Tatius quarreled. The Sabines wanted one of their own as king. The Romans insisted the king should be Roman. Finally, they agreed that each nation would choose a king from the other. In ancient times, nations lived in fixed forms. Civil relations were marked by divisions and subdivisions. Cities becoming nations were divided into tribes. Herodotus mentions tribes in Cyrene's colonization. Thurii was similarly organized. When a people existed as a township, citizens were divided into gens, clans. Each gens had a common chapel and a common hero. These gentes were united into curiae. Gentes were not families, but free corporations. Sometimes they were closed, sometimes open. New members could be assigned by the state. The Great Council at Venice, for example, was closed. No one could join without permission. All civil communities had a council and an assembly of burghers. This meant a small council and a great council. The burghers were divided into guilds, called gentes. These were united in parishes. All Latin towns had a council of 100 members. They were divided into 10 curiae. This gave rise to the title of decuriones, which remained in use for civic magistrates for many centuries. Through the Lex Julia, this system was applied to Italian municipia. Savigny proved that the council consisted of 100 members in his History of Roman Law. This system continued into the late Middle Ages. It ended when guilds replaced municipal constitutions. Giovanni Villani says that before the 12th century revolution, Florence had 100 buoni uomini who administered the city. These 100 were not all nobles. They were burghers and country people, similar to small imperial cities or Swiss cantons. Each represented a gens. Propertius calls them patres pellidi. The Curio of Rome, a simple cottage covered with straw, reminds us that Rome was once a small town buried in the night of history, surrounded by its little domain. The earliest events we can discern come from comparing allegories in other parts of Italy. There was a long period of commotion among Italian nations. This did not end when the Oscans moved from Lake Fucinus to the Alban Lake. The Sabines also advanced far beyond the areas we know from tradition. The Sabines began as a small tribe. Later, they became one of the greatest nations of Italy. Tribes descended from them include the Marrucinians, Caudines, Vestinians, Marsians, Polignians, Samnites, Lucanians, Bruttians, Oscanpart, and Picentians. There are few traditions about their settlements. By the time Rome was founded, the Sabines were widely spread. They are said to have been guided by a bull into Opica, occupying the Samnite country. Earlier, they may have migrated down the Tiber. Sabine towns were sometimes mixed with Latin towns, including settlements on the Anio. The country later inhabited by the Sabines may not have been fully settled by them until later. Falerii was a Tuscan town, once thoroughly Tyrrhenian. As the Sabines advanced, some Latin towns remained independent. Others were subdued. Fidini belonged to the former. North of it, the land was Sabine. Near ancient Rome, a Sabine town existed on the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, close to the Latin town. Its mere existence is all we know. Tradition says there was previously a Siculian town called Satinia on the Capitoline. The Sabines must have conquered it. Another ancient town may have existed on the Janiculum. Regardless, many small towns existed in the district. The two towns could coexist because a deep marsh separated them. The Palatine town may have depended on the Sabine conqueror Titus Tatius. He was killed during the Laurentine sacrifice, and his memory was hateful to Romans. A Sabine town on the Quirinal is confirmed by several Sabine chapels. These were known as late as Varro's time. From them, he showed that Romans adopted Sabine rituals. This Sabine influence in Roman worship has often been overlooked. The tradition says the Sabine women were carried off because there was no rite of intermarriage. This event symbolized the relationship between the two towns before that rite existed. The Sabines held the upper hand and refused the right. The Romans obtained it by force. Originally, the Sabines were the ruling people, but during a Roman uprising, several Sabine towns, like Antemne and Fidini, were subdued. This separated the Sabines from their kin. The Romans re-established their independence by war. The result, according to tradition, was that the two towns became closely united. Each town had a senate of 100 members and a king. They formed offensive and defensive alliances. Burghers of both towns met together in the space between them, later called the Comitium. In this way, they formed a united state for foreign affairs. The idea of a double state was known to ancient writers. Evidence appears in scattered passages, especially among the scholiasts. The head of Janus, shown on the earliest Roman coins, symbolizes this. The vacant throne beside Romulus's chair represents the equal but dormant right of the other people. Concord between the towns did not last long. The Roman king eventually assumed supremacy over the Sabines. The two councils were united into one senate under a single king. It was agreed that the king should alternate between a Roman and a Sabine. Each was chosen by the other people. If a king displeased the non-electing people, he was not forced upon them. He received imperium only if the auguries were favorable and the nation sanctioned him. The non-electing tribe had the right to accept or reject his election. This explains the double election, previously misunderstood. One portion elected, the other sanctioned. This ensured that a king elected by Romans was also acceptable to the Sabines. After generations of separate existence, the two states united. The towns ceased to exist as towns. The burghers of each became tribes. The nation then consisted of two tribes. The earliest address to the Roman people was Populus Romanus Quaelites. When its origin was forgotten, it became Populus Romanus Quaerites. This change is older than Livy. The correct form continued in use, but was partly replaced by the false one. The tradition wrongly states that after the Union, the name Quaerites became the common designation for all. In fact, the term was not used this way until much later. It was later applied to plebeians, long after distinctions between Romans, Sabines, Luce res, patricians, and plebeians had almost vanished. Thus, the two towns existed side by side, eventually as tribes. The two towns eventually formed one state. Calling the Latins rams and the Sabines titties reflects the ancient tradition. The derivation from Romulus and Tatius is incorrect, but that does not affect the view. Dionysius had good materials, especially for the consular period, but he gives only part of the story. For the kingly period, he was well informed. He notes a dispute between the two tribes about the senates. Numa resolved it by not depriving the rams of anything and giving honors to the titties. The Senate, first 100 members, later 200, was divided into 10 decuries. Each decury was led by a decent primus. These leaders were taken from the rams. The college, when there was no king, governed one after another, each for 5 days. Dionysius confused this with the Greek prytanes, and Plutarch misunderstood entirely. The number of augurs and pontiffs was also doubled. Each college had 4 members, 2 from rams and 2 from titties. The exact chronology is uncertain, but these changes are historically certain. Rome in this stage had equalization between the two tribes. Errors of detail exist in Dionysius, but historians like Bersonius, Scaliger, and Cujacius helped correct them. Bersonius sometimes overcorrected, and Gronovius opposed him. Some erroneous expressions were established even before Livy. This period of equalization is one of peace. It is described as the reign of Numa. Traditions about him are simple and brief. Numa's rule represents a peaceful condition with a holy man at the head. He was inspired by the goddess Egeria, married in her grove. She guided him into the choir of her sisters. When Numa died, Egeria's tears formed a spring. The peaceful period of 40 years is beautiful, but historically impossible. Numa's piety supposedly prevented war from surrounding nations. Numa's death ends the first saeculum. A new period begins, similar to Hesiod's Iron Age after the Age of Heroes. Up to this point, we have mostly poetry. With Tullus Hostilius, a kind of history begins. Events now appear more historical, though still partly legendary. The destruction of Alba is probably historical. The reception of the Albans at Rome is likely true. The conquests of Ancus Marcius also seem credible. These are islands of real history amid fables. The history that follows is like a picture seen from the wrong side. The kings' names are fictitious. The lengths of their reigns are unknown. 7 kings were supposed to rule, likely for symbolic reasons. Chronological statements from this period are therefore unreliable. The period from Rome's origin to the construction of its later monuments should be thought of as a succession of centuries rather than precise dates.